Minister, thank you for making time to be here with us today. My first question is as follows. Yesterday, there was an announcement made with regards to Google and the government making a deal. Before I get into that, maybe I'll just preface with this. You stated that the Liberal government, and I'll quote directly, put C-18 forward to fix a commercial and power imbalance between tech giants and our news media sector, end quote. But the deal that was entered into yesterday between Google and the government would actually appear to show that Google forced the hand of the government. Google got everything it wanted. $100 million spent, one agreement, and one collective chosen by Google on their terms. And so it's clear then that big tech is actually in the driver's seat. So my question for you, Minister, is this your idea of fixing the power imbalance that exists between big tech and the news industry by giving them more control?
Madame la Présidente, je suis pas d'accord.
Madam Chair, I disagree with the fashion in which yesterday's announcement has been interpreted by my colleague. I would like to remind us that Google and Facebook opposed the government's legislating in this area. They didn't believe that the government should do so, and we decided to go ahead nevertheless, presenting legislation that allows to create a commercial balance that's much fairer between the tech giants and Canadian media.
Toward you, I did ask you a very specific question, and I would ask that you answer the specific question.
Exactement ce que je dis. Google ne...
Well, exactly what I've done. Google didn't want this type of legislation. Now there is this legislation. $100 million must be paid. It will be indexed annually, and this will go to the Canadian culture and communication sector. They would have preferred only to pay anything to those they decided to pay money to, but we have insisted.
Next question, because it's clear that you don't want to answer that one. It is unfortunate, though, that more power was put in the hands of big tech, that Google was given control over the terms, because the whole point of Bill C-18 was actually to help level the playing field. That's what's been touted the entire time. But at the end of the day, what we've landed with is Meta has walked away. They're no longer carrying news. And Google said that they would stay and they would negotiate, but only on their terms. And so the government and Google entered into a backroom, and they created a deal. They cooked up a deal. And all of Google's terms have been met. And so it's another example of big tech and big government colluding, and it ultimately will damage news in this country. It will damage accessibility to news and the choice that Canadians have with regard to news. So yesterday was actually a really sad day in Canada, because that's the impact that it will ultimately have. Now, my question with regards to this agreement that was cooked up is I'm wondering if you can describe the criteria that the government will use to determine whether a news business gets state approval to join a collective. So what is the criteria that the government will use to determine whether or not an outlet is an eligible news business?
Madame la Présidente, beaucoup a été dit, puis je tiens...
Madam Chair, a good deal has been said, but allow me to remind us of the facts. The agreement that was come to yesterday with Google regarding online news was that Google undertakes to pay $100 million to Canadian media on a yearly basis. This will be inflation indexed. As for the criteria, which outlets will have access to this, I dislike being interrupted constantly.
Madam Chair, the Minister was trying to answer her question. It would be great if the Minister would have the opportunity to respond and we could hear the answer to her question rather than being interrupted by Ms. Thomas.
Continue. Pardon?
I trust my time was stopped.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Minister, my question was with regards to criteria, nothing else. I just want to know the government's criteria to determine an eligible news business to enter into a deal with Google.
Les
Just the
critères
criteria.
sont à l'article 11.
I refer you to Section 11.1 of the law. It includes independent media, official languages, media in minority situations, and traditional media as well, legacy media, Indigenous language media. All media carrying out journalism in Canada they'll be able to put their hands up and become part of that collective under the agreement with Google.
Now, the CBC already receives $1.4 billion in taxpayer money, and they receive another $400 million in ad revenue and subscription fees. So will the CBC be approved as an eligible news business in this deal with Google?
CBC Radio-Canada est éligible selon les...
CBC Radio-Canada is an eligible news business under the legislation. We also took into account that CBC Radio-Canada hires about a third of the journal and news workers in the country, and this will be taken into account in the final regulations that will be published when the legislation is brought in.
So my question is this: how much will the CBC get?
La réglementation est présente.
The regulation is currently being reviewed by the Order in Council, and details will be published before the 18th of December when the legislation is brought in.
Google will ultimately get to determine which collective it enters into an agreement with. What criteria will Google use?
Les médias vont devoir se regrouper dans...
Media will come together in a collective that they will manage to handle negotiation with Google and also redistribution of the funds in a transparent and fair manner.
Collectives, not necessarily one.
C'est possible, ça va être possible selon la loi.
It will be possible under the legislation that several collectives carry out the negotiation, that there be solely one negotiating for the entire news sector.
Questioner, thank you. And that's Mrs. Thomas. Your questions, please.
Minister, when I asked you about the amount of money that CBC would get, you said that they have 1/3 of all the journalists in the country. We know that the draft regulations suggest that the money from the $100 million fund that Google is generating will be divvied up according to the number of journalists that are in each news businesses. So I'm assuming then that the CBC will get 1/3 of the $100 million, which is $33 million. Do you believe that that's just when we consider local newspapers, ethnic newspapers, BIPOC newspapers, Indigenous newspapers, that will only get a small pittance? When in fact your government actually claimed that this bill was about supporting local news, small outlets. That is not the case. That is not the case. 1/3 of the amount will go to CBC. According to the PBO officer, 75% total will go to the big players such as the CBC, such as Rogers, such as Bell, such as Torstar. How will this bill support local, ethnic, BIPOC news outlets?
Merci, Madame la Présidente, puis je vais...
Thank you, Chair. And I will respond in my maternal language because I have full respect for all these questions being put, and I want to be sure that I use the right vocabulary and provide a clear answer. As I've said, the final regulations will be published before the legislation, the Act, comes into effect on the 19th of December. We take into account the fact that CBC Radio-Canada represents a large proportion of journalists of the country, and it's important that the $100 million from Google is also distributed to local, independent, and Indigenous media outlets, all the media that my colleague here in her question has touched on. We want to make sure, and we shall make sure that that's the case.
Unfortunately, they're misplaced. Those local media outlets will receive very little and possibly nothing at all. This bill has killed them. Big tech has colluded with big government to do away with news in this country. It will be less choice for Canadians and less access for Canadians. It's a shame. And let's not forget the fact that actually Google isn't signing on to Bill C-18. They've actually been granted an exemption. So, Minister, when you celebrate the success of 18, let's look at this. Facebook walked away. They're not carrying news anymore, so they're not under Bill C-18. Google, that's the second one it applied to. They applied for an exemption. You entered into a backroom deal with them, and they got what they wanted. So Bill C-18 technically applies to no one. It's an absolute failure. It's a boondoggle, Minister. So let's be really clear about the facts here.